At 0210 hours local time, on the eastern edge of the Crimean Peninsula, a wall of white-blue light erupted over the village of Hlazivka. It was not a bomb, it was electricity tearing itself apart. Inside the PP2 Crimea transition point, transformers arced, oil ignited, and a column of fire and black smoke climbed nearly 200 feet into the night sky. Seconds later, the lights went out, not in one town, but across a peninsula of 2.5 million people. This was the point where power from mainland Russia crossed into occupied Crimea. 4 undersea cables, 14.5 kilometers long, feeding up to 800 megawatts into the peninsula's only real lifeline. To reach it, cheap Ukrainian drones had crossed more than 150 miles of some of the most heavily defended airspace in the entire war. Past S-400 batteries, past Pantsir guns bolted onto the Kerch Bridge itself. But what made this strike different was not the distance and not the fire, it was the target. Ukraine was not trying to burn a fuel depot or destroy a runway, they were reaching for a single switch, the one that kept the lights on for all of Crimea, and they were about to flip it off. To understand why one transition point mattered so much, you have to understand what Crimea really is. Not a fortress, not a self-sufficient stronghold, an energy dead end. The peninsula has no power grid ring of its own. It does not sit in the middle of a web of lines that can reroute current when one path fails. It hangs at the end of a single artery, the Kuban Crimea energy bridge, laid across the bottom of the Kerch Strait after 2014 when saboteurs cut the old lines from mainland Ukraine and plunged Crimea into darkness for days. Russia's answer was those 4 undersea cables, and the place where all 4 rise out of the sea and turn into overhead power lines is PP2 Crimea near Hlazivka. Cut that one node and you do not damage the grid, you unplug it. Moscow knew this was a weakness, so it built insurance. 2 gas-fired power plants inside Crimea itself, Balaclava near Sevastopol and Tavrida near Simferopol, opened by Putin in 2019 and meant to cover most of the peninsula's needs. But the insurance had a flaw sewn into it. Both plants run on gas piped in from mainland Russia, and they run on Western turbines that sanctions now keep Russia from properly repairing. So even the backup depends on Russia, and every hit wears down machines that can no longer be fixed. This was the target, not a symbol, the one physical point where the light for 2.5 million people entered the peninsula, the place Moscow believed had made Crimea permanent, wired forever to the mainland. Ukraine was about to prove that a wire can be cut. Now look at what was sent to cut that wire and what was waiting to stop it. The drones were FP-1s, long-range one-way attack aircraft that cost only a few $1,000s each. Plywood and composite bodies, a small warhead, a simple engine, cheap enough to send in numbers, cheap enough to lose. Against them stood one of the densest air defense concentrations of the entire war. Around the Kerch Strait, Russia had stacked S-400 batteries worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Buk M3 systems, and Pantsir S-1 guns, some bolted directly onto the Kerch Bridge, each Pantsir running an estimated $15 to $20 million. On paper, it was a fortress with no gaps. But the battlefield does not run on the price tag. A billion-dollar system still needs a human crew to see a target, decide it is real, choose it over a decoy, rotate the launcher, and fire. And that takes seconds. Ukraine's entire method was built around those seconds. They were not trying to defeat the S-400. They were not trying to outshoot the Pantsir. They only needed to make each system a few seconds slower than the drone was fast. A radar that hesitates for 6 seconds against an aircraft crossing a mile in under 40 has already lost. Ukraine did not need to win the whole sky over Crimea. They needed one node, PP2, and a handful of cheap drones that reached it before the expensive ones could react. That is the asymmetry. Russia had to protect everything everywhere all night. Ukraine only had to arrive at a single switch once before anyone could stop them. To picture the wall the FP-1s had to cross, walk it from the outside in. The outer ring was the S-400 Triumf, positioned to lock down the skies over eastern Crimea from long range. Its surveillance radar can sweep for targets at great distance, and its interceptors reach out for miles. a system designed to kill fighter jets high in the sky long before they ever see their target. Behind it sat the Buk M3, the medium-range layer, there to catch anything that slipped inside the S-400's reach and to shield the bigger system when threats came in low and fast. Closer still came the Pantsir S-1, the point defense shield, missiles paired with twin 30mm cannons firing thousands of rounds a minute. Russia had mounted some of these directly on the Kerch Bridge, guarding the crossing and the power lines feeding off it. Layered through all of it was electronic warfare. Jammers along the bridge approaches built to scramble satellite navigation to make an incoming drone lose track of where it was. And overhead, Russian fighters flew combat patrols, hunting the slow, low-flying machines the missiles were too fast to catch. Against that, the FP-1, wingspan a little over 10 feet, a warhead in the tens of pounds, a range measured in the hundreds of miles, cruising low at roughly 90 to 100 miles per hour. Its most important feature was what it did not need. It did not rely on GPS to find PP2. Its course was loaded before launch, an inertial guidance system counting its own motion, following a pre-programmed route stored in memory. Jam the satellites all you want. The drone still knew where it was going. To blind it, you had to physically stop it. And to stop it, every one of those layers had just a few seconds to work. At 01:58 hours local time, the FP-1S came in low over the Sea of Azov, a loose stream of small dots skimming just above the water. At that altitude, the curve of the Earth itself became a shield. The S-400's radar is devastating when it looks up into open sky, but a target crawling a few dozen feet over the waves hides inside sea clutter, inside the reflections off every wave. On the Russian screens, the drones flickered, appearing, vanishing, appearing again, too slow for cruise missiles, too low for aircraft. Here was the arithmetic Ukraine lived on. From the moment a track firmed up to the moment a missile left the rail, the S-400 crew needed several seconds to confirm the target was real, assign it, and fire. In those same seconds, a drone at 95 miles per hour covered more than a quarter mile and dropped back into the clutter before the launcher finished turning. The missiles had the range, the crews had the screens, but everything was happening too low and too close to catch. At 0202 hours, the lead drones crossed into the electronic warfare curtain along the Kerch approaches. Coordinates on the control feed jumped and scattered. This was the moment the jammers were built for, and the moment the FP-1s cared about least. They stopped trusting the satellites and flew on inertial guidance, counting their own motion, holding the memorized line toward Hlazivka. But the sky held one thing the planners could not script. A Russian fighter on night patrol found the formation and fired. The lead aircraft, the one the others were pacing off, vanished from the feed. For a few seconds, the stream had no head. Imagine you are the operator watching that screen go dark. No lead, no reference, a jamming wall on every side. This is where the mission dies, or where months of preparation pay off. The team switched control to the next drone in line and let it take the point, feeding the preloaded route forward through the formation. And they steered into a gap they already knew was there. In the weeks before, Ukrainian strikes had knocked out S-400 radars and Pantsir guns around this very crossing. 21st of June, 24th of June, 4 Pantsirs gone near Kerch, 2 off the bridge itself. The shield had holes punched in it before the drones ever arrived. The FP-1s threaded straight through them. What would you have done with 3 seconds and no lead drone abort or push a machine you could barely see toward the target? Ukraine pushed. At 0207 hours, near PP2 itself, the last layer opened up. A Pantsir swung its cannons toward the low approach, 30mm fire weaving a net across the sky at thousands of rounds a minute. The FP-1S answered the only way that works. They dropped lower, almost onto the ground, below the altitude where the gun's radar could cleanly separate them from the clutter. And ahead of the real drones went the cheap ones, decoys with no warhead, same size and shape, drawing the first bursts of fire. The crew faced the problem Ukraine engineered for them. Shoot at everything and burn through ammunition, or take the seconds to sort real from fake. Either choice cost time. And time was the one thing the drones were spending faster than the defenders could. Some FP-1s were hit. torn apart over the fields short of the station, but every missile spent, every burst fired at a decoy was a few seconds the survivors used to close the last mile toward the transition point. The wall had done its job on paper. In the air, enough drones were still flying, low, blind to GPS, guided by memory, and PP-2 was dead ahead. Several drones went down on that last mile, but those losses were already counted. Ukraine never planned for every FP-1 to arrive, only for enough of them to. The decoys had drawn the fire, the low approach had beaten the guns, and now the survivors slid over the last stretch of ground toward the transition point. Cameras filled with the cold rectangular shapes of PP-2 rising against the night. The first drone picked the highest value structure it had been sent for, the conversion hall, where the 4 undersea cables come ashore and hand their current to the overhead lines. The warhead punched through the outer skin and detonated inside. What followed was not a fuel explosion. It was worse for a power node. The blast tore open a transformer, and the moment its insulation failed, the electricity did the rest. An arc leapt across the broken gap, a bolt of man-made lightning hotter than the surface of the sun, and the transformer's cooling oil caught fire. Flame climbed the structure. The short ripped back through the switchgear, and protective breakers slammed open all down the line, trying to save themselves by cutting the current. Each one that tripped dropped another section of grid into darkness. Then the second drone arrived, and the third, spacing their hits across the bus bars and the adjacent transformers so no single surviving unit could carry the load alone. One failure pulled the next. A cascade, the thing every power engineer fears, rolled outward from Hlazivka faster than any crew could react. And across the peninsula, the lights began to die, not all at once, but region by region, as the trips propagated down the wire. Kerch, then the towns inland, then the cities. From a single burning node on the eastern shore, the darkness spread west across all of Crimea. Ukraine had not destroyed the grid. They had made it switch itself off. There is a difference between destruction and paralysis. Destruction burns one target and leaves a scar you can photograph. Paralysis reaches the thing that keeps everything else running and switches it off. That night at Hlazivka, a handful of drones cheaper than a used car did not blow up an army. They pulled a plug that 2.5 million people depend on. And the deeper Russia looked, the worse the trap became. Crimea has no grid ring of its own, only that single artery from the mainland, and 2 backup plants that run on Russian gas through turbine sanctions won't let them fix. Strike the node, and the peninsula goes dark. Strike the gas that feeds the backups, and it stays dark. Every layer of insurance Moscow built after 2014 shared the same flaw. It all traces back to a wire, a pipe, a supply line that a cheap drone can reach. PP-2 was not one bad night. It was the 50th energy node Ukraine hit in 8 days, a campaign designed not to destroy Crimea's grid, but to exhaust it, one switch at a time. That is the message that carried further than any fireball. If the point where the light enters Crimea can be reached and shut off, then nothing behind it is truly safe. Not the substations, not the power plants, not the idea that the peninsula was ever wired to Russia for good. Every system Russia now pulls back to guard the rear is one less system at the front, and a rear that has to defend its own light bulbs is no longer a fortress. It is a liability. So here's the question worth arguing over. Is Ukraine's smarter path to keep hunting the tanks and guns at the front, or to keep switching off the power, the fuel, and the supply lines that make them work at all? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you believe Ukraine deserves to live in peace and freedom, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Every bit of support helps more people understand what is really happening in this war. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.